are ready to dive in, so with no further ado, I will turn it to Professor Engell, who is one of our judges and a renowned scholar of climate writing and member of the English department. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. What I have to say this afternoon, I hope will offer some hints that might help all of your writing, not just your writing for this contest. That's the immediate purpose of this workshop. I'm also going to leave quite a lot of time for any questions you might have. One of the first things that ancient rhetoricians did when they thought about writing was they divided the process of writing into three main steps, and we still do that today. One might be called invention. That is to say, how do you conceive of the piece you're writing? What's your overall view of it? What's the big idea? What form is it going to take? Will it be a story? Will it be an op-ed? Will it be a poem? What kind of writing is it, and what is the compelling idea or thrust behind it? The second is design. Now, there are different words for that. Organization, order. In other words, what is the shape of the piece that you're writing? What comes first, what comes last, and why? And the third was very often referred to simply as style. That is to say, what is the quality of language in the writing? Is it exciting? Is it hackneyed and boring? Is it bureaucratese? Is it a parody? Is the word choice really good? Are the sentences comprehensible? And can someone say, I really enjoyed reading that, or not? So those are three general terms to look at all of the writing you do, not just for this contest. This contest asks you to write something that's pretty short, 1,250 words. It's not all that long. You know, it's about 4.5 typewritten pages, double spaced, something like that. So, as in all writing, absolute economy of expression is important. And that's far harder to achieve than one might think. Mark Twain once wrote to a friend of his, I'm writing you a long letter because I don't have time to write you a short letter. In other words, when there's something really important to say, can you say it quickly and succinctly? Or are you going to fall all over yourself, as we almost always do, myself included, when we start to make a first draft? All beginnings are difficult. And in my experience as a teacher, most of the time, not all the time, the worst writing often appears at the beginning of a composition, because it has never been gone back to and thrown out and started all over again. It's always hard to begin, and that's often reflected in the nature of the beginning of any argument or piece. You're going to have to learn, if you haven't already, to become your own harshest critic. That is to say, every good writer has an internalized sense of criticism. That means to say you're not happy with what you've written. You can't be happy with what you've written. Otherwise it won't get better. That's true. So the French writer Valéry said about writing poetry, for example, he said, no poem is ever finished. It is only abandoned in despair. Meaning there are a certain number of times that you can go back to it and make changes and revisions, and finally you give up because you reach the law of diminishing returns. Language is slippery, it's tough. One way to think about revision, you've all revised the draft you've written, right? You've gone back and revised. But it's actually psychologically pretty burdensome to try to revise everything at once. In other words, are you going to revise the organization, or are you going to revise the word choice? Are you going to revise the references you've used? Or what are you going to revise? Can you do it all at once? It's actually very hard. So one way to revise your work is to say, well, now I'm going to go through and I'm going to revise only the organization, or I'm going to revise only my sentence length and structure, or I'm going to revise only my vocabulary, Or I'm going to look only for repetitions and cross those out. And you can say, boy, that sounds like a lot of revisions. And my answer would be yes, maybe it's 5 or 6 revisions. But if you're looking for one main thing each time you revise, you can go pretty quickly. That kind of layered or iterative revision can be very valuable. Now, here's another hint. I suggest you try it sometime if you've never tried it. After you've written a draft and after you think you're pretty happy with it, hand it to someone. Don't keep a copy of it yourself. And have that person read it out loud to you slowly in a neutral tone. And just listen to it. You will be amazed, I think, at how differently you perceive what you've written in that context. Because all of a sudden it's coming at you from another voice, essentially another direction, and you don't have the crutch of looking at it. If you hear a sentence that doesn't quite make sense, if you hear something that is hard to follow as you listen, that's something that probably needs revision. It's a good technique. Ask a friend to do it. A friend ought to be able to do it, especially for something that's pretty short. Okay, think of your audience. Always think of your audience. Who are they? Who is your audience? This particular contest is not about academic writing necessarily. It could be about writing a children's book. That would be fair game for this contest. You write a children's book for children ages 4 to 7 about climate. That's your audience then. But maybe you're writing a short policy paper. That's something to think about then. Who is your audience for that? Or maybe you're writing an op-ed or a guest essay for a newspaper. What kind of audience would that be? Probably pretty general, pretty wide audience, people in different fields, different backgrounds, maybe even different levels of education. So think of your audience and try to get in your mind a sense of who exactly that audience is. If you don't have a good sense of your audience, it's very hard to write effective prose or effective poetry, effective fiction or effective nonfiction. Don't preach to the choir. That is to say, if you have a certain audience, it's a waste of time to tell them what they're already convinced of. It's a waste of time to inform them of what they already know. You might remind them, but remind them in a way that doesn't insult them, because maybe they don't already know it even though they should. So think of your audience when you are trying, especially, to persuade them. If you're trying to persuade a group of some particular point, say about climate issue or climate policy or the urgency of it, you need to speak to the people who are unconvinced as yet, or who are sitting on the fence. Not to those whom you know will already accept what you're saying. Now, here's something which is applicable to everything you write also that has an argument. Anything you write that has an argument. You want to make the case. You must also think of the strongest case against yourself. You have to think dialectically. So if you're writing some kind of editorial or guest essay or policy paper, you have to imagine, you have to research, perhaps even, what is the strongest argument against you? There must be one. I mean, if you're writing about anything worthwhile, there has to be some contentiousness about it in an argument. There's got to be some different point of view. If you're not aware of it, and if you can't express it, then what will happen?
You're going to face up.
Yeah, somebody else will. Somebody else will write in and say, wait a minute, so-and-so says such and such, but. So it's very important for you to include in any argumentative piece a recognition of what is arrayed against you. and use your maximum intelligence in order to do that. And then answer it. Rebut it. This is like a debate. But every argument, in some sense, is a debate. And you say, well, where's my opposition? You don't know where your opposition is yet, but let me guarantee you, they're out there somewhere. Almost anything on any issue, whether it's, say, tax policy, or climate, or child care, or pick the obvious ones, gun control, abortion, whatever, they're always going to have people who are going to say, I disagree. And they'll come after you. So try to think of what the best argument against you is. Another thing about arguments. If you're writing something fairly short, there might be a tendency to hold your big argument or your conclusion until the end. I'd recommend against doing that. Very often people think the conclusion of a piece should be where you put forward your largest and most important statement of what you have in fact concluded. But the conclusion isn't really the place for that. The conclusion is the place to stir things up into a heightened pitch, not to make it your strongest case. Anybody here play chess? Chess player here? A chess player. Well, that's all right. No, everybody's like this in chess, except the grandmasters. So Bobby Fischer was a great chess champion. He beat Boris Spassky and was the world champion at times. And somebody once asked Bobby Fischer, how is it that you can win and win so quickly in many matches? And the person asking the question probably thought that Fischer was going to give a very elaborate answer, like, well, I used a such and such gambit, or I used such and such an opening, or in the end game I do this and that. But his answer was very simple and short. I get the big pieces out early. And that meant he got out the pieces that had lines of force on the board, the rooks, the castles, so to speak, the queens, the bishops. He got them out on the board as quickly as he could in any given game. And I would recommend that if you're writing something with an argument, that's what you should do. Now you can say, well, I can't just start the piece by elaborating my whole argument. That's pretty bald. That's true. But you can, at least at the beginning, tip your hand or give a teaser or a summary of what your main argument is, and then get to it pretty quickly. And you'll want your main argument, of course, to come before you state what opposition might be mounted against you. That comes later. And then your rebuttal to that comes yet later. So if you're thinking about some kind of policy or argument, think about trying to get those big pieces out early. You ever pick up an essay in a magazine or a newspaper editorial and not finish it? Yeah, why? Why did you not finish it? For what reasons might you not finish it?
Hit a boring snag.
It's boring. What else?
And it's too long.
It's too long. It's too long for what it has to say. I mean, sometimes I picked up essays and I thought, get to the point. What are you're writing about this issue? I'm halfway through and I still don't know what your argument is. You know, people have limited time in their lives. And it's nice to think that somebody's going to lean back and give you 15 minutes to read your piece, but they might not. So the most fatal of all faults is not to be able to hold your reader's attention. Okay, just a couple more things. The purpose of this particular context for effective climate writing is not just, say, to make people think or reflect, not just to inform them, not just to persuade them, but ultimately, ideally, to get them to act, to get them to do something, to get them to do something that they aren't already doing. Now that something may not be specific, or it may be specific. That is to say, it may be enough to create such a sense of urgency in someone that they realize they've got to change their habits, they've got to change their view, and they're going to do it. Maybe they'll vote in a different way, maybe they'll take a different attitude toward the production of certain kinds of energy, maybe they'll think about tax incentives or subsidies in a different way. Who knows what they'll do? But you've got to get them to do something. Action is the end. It's the final goal. It's not information alone. It's not research alone. And that is what makes this writing somewhat different. Now you can say, wait a minute, you're talking about advocacy of some sort. And I would say, yes, you are talking about advocacy of some sort. Now maybe the advocacy is simply, you ought to think more seriously and at least consider the possibility of some sort of, price on carbon, say. We need to put a price on carbon. People have been talking about that for, a decade, 2 decades. We don't have a price on carbon in this country. How would you get somebody to get to the point where not only they think about it, but they might actually advocate it? Can you do it in 1,250 words? You can certainly make an attempt. The maximum length of most newspaper op-eds is about what? Does anyone know? Does anyone here ever write one? No? If you had to guess, how many words do you think are in an average newspaper op-ed? 750. Yeah, it's about 800. Yep. It's about 800 words. Sometimes it's 850. If you're a special person, the editor might give you 900 or so. But you're very unlikely to get more than that, 900. 1,000, very, very rare. Okay. You can say, well, this instrumentalizes my writing. It makes my writing turn into something to advocate change or to put before the world a new perspective that people should pay attention to. And the answer is yes. Yeah. Does that mean that you can't also have aesthetic qualities to your writing? In other words, does that mean that this has to be a purely utilitarian kind of writing? No. It's absolutely possible to combine fine writing with writing that is persuasive of a particular point. And there are many examples of that, say in American history. Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July, a great oration he gave in the 1850s. That's a marvelous example. Margaret Chase Smith talking in the 1950s about the dangers of the politics of smear and personal degradation. It's a very well constructed speech. It has wonderful aesthetic qualities, and yet it makes an excellent political point about the dangers of extremism and polarization. This is in the early 1950s, during the McCarthy. So you can have both aesthetic qualities, that is to say, writing that's appealing just for the quality of its language, as well as for its ideas or its advocacy. There are lots of really great writers who have done this with their writing. That is to say, advocated something. Frank Norris, who wrote about monopolies in the early 20th century in the United States. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote about the way women were treated in the late 19th and early 20th century. John Steinbeck, who wrote The Grapes of Wrath. Octavia Butler, the great science fiction writer of the late 20th century. Many fine writers who are both aesthetic and also, in some ways, advocating something. Okay, now here's something which I think is obvious, but it needs to be mentioned because it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Let me explain. Let's say you're writing some kind of piece, whatever it is, maybe fiction, maybe nonfiction, maybe an op-ed, it may be an excerpt from a book, it could be, and there's something in it that you've got factually wrong. I mean, no arguments, please, it's wrong. You can't say, oh, but you made a mistake. What happens to your entire piece?
has no standing.
Huh?
It has no standing.
That's right, it's gone. It's completely open to attack. It has become utterly ineffective. And this has happened a lot in climate debates. If somebody gets something wrong or even seems to get something wrong, they are almost immediately, from some other quarter, whether it's direct opposition or not, they're almost immediately dismissed or attacked because they got something wrong. They got the percentage of methane leakage wrong. They made a mistake and put down parts per million instead of parts per billion. Oops. So, it sounds elementary, but it's really important. Every single thing that has a factual basis of any kind has to be absolutely on the up and up. Now, what happens if you can't find an absolute authority for a particular fact? One person says one thing authoritatively, another person says another thing authoritatively. What do you do in that case?
To say that's in their opinion.
Well, you can, yes, or you could welcome your reader into the fact that there is this divergence and point it out explicitly, so that your reader has the confidence that you, as the writer, are aware of this. In other words, the reader understands that you have recognized that there is no apparent real authority on this subject. Now, that helps you because it makes the reader trust you more that you are aware of this. You haven't gone just to one source quickly, which is a treachery of online research. Really. I've been caught in it once or twice. Oh yeah, so-and-so says, boom. No, that was wrong. Turns out. So, all right. One blemish of that kind in almost any composition, particularly a shorter one, will sink the composition. It's not got a chance. It also hurts one's reputation. It's hard to recover from if it's a public document. Now, I said today we'd talk about three things, and I'm going to sort of close with that and then have time for questions. I'm going to talk about three things. And in old rhetoric, studies of older rhetoric, they were given Greek names. Logos, pathos, and ethos. What are these? How would you translate it? Logos essentially means knowledge or the chain of reasoning or logic in the piece. And every piece, even fiction, has some sort of logic or chain behind it, some sort of plot, some sort of direction. And it often contains some reference to factual material as well. So logos is something that is important to express and be certain about. Pathos doesn't really translate as pathetic, because today the word pathetic means, oh, that is pathetic, or it can mean something more profound. It can mean, yeah, it's pathetic. But that's not what pathos here means. It simply means you've got to arouse emotion. Pathos here has to do with emotion, passion. Good writing of any kind, almost of any kind, with the possible exception of strict scientific writing, needs to develop some sense of emotion. Otherwise, how are you going to engage your reader and actually get them to do something? I would say even some kinds of scientific writing engage emotion if the authors feel the urgency of the interpretation or the case they are presenting. Now, very often you will find that in scientific commentary rather than in a scientific report. But if you look at the magazine Nature, a very famous magazine, you will see that they often run a section called commentary. And in that section, you will find pathos as well as logos. you'll find them combined. So if you can't arouse your audience's feeling, you're not going to get them to act. That's the theory behind it. Even the philosopher David Hume, who was a really smart cookie when it came to intellectual matters and cognitive matters, and had died in the womb empiricist, meaning he cared about facts and experience. He said, every idea we have, every idea you have, is accompanied by some emotion. Now think about that for a second. Maybe the emotion is very low grade. Maybe the simmering only. But you don't care much about it. Well, that's the emotion maybe of apathy or boredom. You're not going to be moved to do much if the idea elicits only that in you. Maybe the idea elicits anger or resentment. That's a motivator. Fear is a motivator. Concern for other people is a motivator. Concern for the next generation is a motivator. Concern for one's neighbor is a motivator. And all of those essentially are feelings. And the more that you can connect legitimate, by legitimate I mean feelings that are not simply concocted out of some gratuitous sense. You ever watch a movie and you say to yourself, that was pretty gratuitous, meaning we didn't need to see that. They didn't need to do that. If it's gratuitous, you feel manipulated. You don't want your audience to feel manipulated. They want to feel a genuine emotion because you yourself feel it. And then the third thing, ethos. This is a tricky one. I think it's the trickiest of all in some ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're making an ethical argument, although you may indeed be doing so. Your argument should stand on its own. Ethos, in this sense, means that the audience has confidence in you that you are an honest broker, that you yourself are to be trusted, that the way you have written convinces your audience that you're not trying to pull the wool over their eyes, you're not trying to manipulate them cynically, you're not telling them half-truths, you're not hiding something. And it's not your reputation as a person, that's something different. It's how what you have written reflects your own character. Have you ever read something and thought, well, I'm not sure I agree with that person's values, or really don't know why they're writing it this way? Or if you've ever listened, to say certain forms of highly charged partisan political speeches, sometimes you come away from feeling, yeah, that's it, go get them. And other times you come away feeling, that's abhorrent. That's ethically abhorrent. Well, ethos is really important, particularly when you're advocating something or trying to make a deep impression for action. And ethos is a very difficult quality to shape into a piece, because it's a sum total of everything you say and how you say it, including your recognition of what the perception of other people might be. Now you can say, how does that appertain in fiction? Well, some fiction writers are able to suggest a very complex world with different points of view in it and different kinds of people. And they are able to paint a picture of a world that is so believable that you can say to yourself, they've got a lot of experience. They understand human beings pretty well. They understand this milieu, this context very well. They've observed acutely. I at least trust them in that regard. It's a matter of trust in the end. So as you think about whatever it is you're writing, you might also want to think about these three qualities: knowledge and argument, chain of reasoning, factual content. the involvement of some associated feeling, and how this is presented as something from a trusted source. If you come across a source that you're not sure about, it is unlikely to move you to any action at all, because you're just not sure you can trust it. Okay, that's really all I had to say. These are just hints about writing, hints maybe for this contest, hints for possibly other things that you write. And I hope they're helpful, but you may have a lot of questions about any of this or anything else having to do with the writing that you think you may be doing. Maybe you've already started. I can't give advice on a particular composition, but if you have a general question or question, please.
How do you suggest developing filters when you don't exactly know who your audience is? You're writing to them.
You have to make a first stab. And that first stab, I would actually call a hypothesis. And you have to test it. And you have to imagine how it might affect certain groups. You have to be willing to change it. If you're not willing to change your hypothesis, then you are fixed in your own thinking to your own first impressions. And that's a pretty dangerous thing. Actually, that's almost the definition of a prejudiced writer. So you have to be willing to change to some degree. One of the accusations leveled against the ancient rhetoricians, as it is sometimes leveled against modern lawyers, is, oh, you're just a hired gun. You're just going to go into the courtroom and persuade people of something even though you don't really believe it's true. You're just trying to make a case in order to win it. But the other side of this is that the idea of writing effectively about a question has, in other times and by other individuals, been connected with the idea of moral philosophy. So almost every professor of rhetoric in the United States used to be called a professor of rhetoric and moral philosophy. And part of what that meant was you have to be willing to change your view. You cannot be rigid, otherwise you're cast like a statue at a certain age or in a certain field, and you won't change your views. Now that's probably not a very good thing to be as a human being to begin with, especially if you live quite a long life. You know, have you ever met someone who believes at 80 exactly what they believed at 20? It's a little scary in some ways, not to be able to change. And within the scope of a single composition, to shrink that time scale down, you have to be willing to change too. And if that means adjusting something to your audience, then you have to do it. Or it means changing your thesis, changing your argument some, you have to do it. It's a test, it's a self-test. You have to put yourself under the microscope too, not just in terms of the quality of your writing, but in terms of what you want to advocate or what you want to put forward. If we all knew exactly what we wanted to put forward the second we sat down, it would simply be a case of design and style. It would not be a case of invention, and it would not be a case of ethos either. It wouldn't. It would just be, well, I already know what I want. And so the process always has to leave leeway for some sort of internal change. And occasionally people change quite a bit. People over time, even a short period of time, can change quite a bit. Take a look at Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery in the 1840s, and then the 1850s, and then the early 1860s. They are not the same at all. He changes. He shifts. And he shifted in part for practical reasons, but in part, I think, because he became convinced that he himself needed to shift because of the nature of the reality around him and his judgment of it. So that's a good question. It's a tough one because it forces self-examination on you. Mm-hmm. I have to say, There's a negative to too much self-examination, as we all know. It's called writer's block. It's called, I can't get anything down now. You know, Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, the over-examined life can't be lived. And the same is true in writing. If you try to do too much self-examination, so sometimes the thing to do is to get up and walk away and then come back to it, and don't be afraid to throw things out. You know, don't be afraid to say, that's no good, that goes in the wastebasket, or it goes in the computer trash, or whatever. I myself, I fudge on that. I always keep a copy of what I throw away. I do, because sometimes I think, no, actually that was a good thought. Or what was the one sentence in that thing I wrote that I wanted to preserve, even though the rest was dross? Well, I threw it out, I don't have it anymore. But I think you shouldn't be afraid to toss stuff to the side. That's the essence of a lot of good revision. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah?
I've never written opinions before. I haven't written op-eds. I just want to know where one should start, because I also don't feel particularly qualified to make opinions on climate change and climate action right now. So I was wondering if you have thoughts.
Well, that's hard. Even experts, or people who are regarded as experts, sometimes don't know where to start or how to express something. You make an effort. For this particular contest, it needs to be your own work, but it doesn't mean you can't ask someone what they think of what you've written. It doesn't mean you can't go to someone and say, here's my draft, what do you think? They can't write for you, but they might say, well, you've got this wrong, or this doesn't sound quite right, or there's a logical leap here, or you're simply repeating yourself. So the only way to improve one's writing is to write. I know that sounds, elementary and tautological, but it is true. There is something to it in the manner of any skill. And of course you need to read along with it if you're writing about something that requires knowledge. But you can't wait forever to write. You can't become a good gymnast by thinking about getting on the balance beam or the rings. You have to do it. You can't become a great pianist by thinking about playing the Moonlight Sonata. You have to do it. And the same is true with writing. It's a little sobering. Maybe I shouldn't mention it, but I don't mean to be discouraging, but I know of no one in the English language who writes their best prose before the age of 30. It's just too complicated and difficult a language to master. Now, are there some people who write their best poetry before the age of 30? Yes, there are, interestingly enough. Poetry is a different kind of medium. But prose, very often, you have so many choices you can make in prose. Every sentence in English can be written so many different ways. The organization of any argument can be done usually in multiple different ways. And it takes quite a long time to be able to write one's best prose. But, you have to start. You have to start. And so I would say, the more you do it, the better. At Yale, that obscure college down in Connecticut somewhere, they have a course called Daily Themes. We don't have that here. And in that course, you've got to write every day. Now, what's the object behind that? It's to get you to practice writing every day. And pretty soon, your inhibitions about sitting down to a blank screen or a blank page begin to melt away because you've done it day after day after day after day. And that's a good thing. Doesn't mean you've done great writing on any one of those days, but but it means somehow you become more accustomed to the process and probably a little more acute in your judgment of your own writing. Other questions? I'll stick around for a few minutes if you want to. Ask. I am looking forward to your entries.
So, the contest just prose?
No, it's anything. It's poetry, it's prose. You could even do a little dramatic scene from a play. You could do a television scene. It's anything as long as it's written, as long as it's in language. And you can include, I think you check the rules, but you can include one illustration, chart, or graph if you think it will really enhance things. Because occasionally it really is important to be able to visualize something. But this is mainly about writing. So you can include one such chart or graph to really help your writing. But yeah, no, it can be any kind of writing. Absolutely. Okay. Yes?
Yes, sorry, one last question.
Oh.
I'm wondering about, so one trouble I have with climate writing in particular is the sort of translation between this, the inspiration behind climate action, which is, very occasionally rooted in natural things and natural beauty, and the translation between that sort of natural beauty and the reality of climate action, which is on Earth, very menial and unsexy and very bureaucratic also sometimes. And so I'm wondering on your thoughts between that transition and how, as you say, you can use the former to somehow inspire the latter.
That's a very good question. It's very tough to do. There are not a lot of writers who are able to link together the human place in nature and the human appreciation of the incredible creation that the natural world is with the idea that we live in a society and in a world in which we've got to have laws, we have economic practices, we have habits, and all of these need to be regulated and drawn up and changed by processes that are often very time-consuming, meaning like committee meetings or legislative processes or hearings or measurement after measurement of certain things. That's a big challenge. And that's one of the greatest challenges, I think, in climate writing to face. But if you can, and I can't give you a formula for doing it, but if you can connect the one which is a human place in an amazing world of biodiversity and beauty, of remarkable wonder, with the fact that we are essentially now the gardeners of the planet. We've got to take care of the planet because we've already dominated it. There was a famous article in 1997 by Vitusik et al. Called Human Domination of Earth's Ecosystems. And it made the point that every single ecosystem on Earth is in fact dominated now by human activity. You go to the bottom of the oceans and what do you find? Radioactive nucleotides from nuclear tests. And other debris from human beings. And so how do you combine that sense of the human place in a wondrous nature with the fact that we're now responsible for managing it all? We are. We've altered it a lot. And now we've got to manage it. If we don't manage it in a way that differs from the way we have been managing it, we're headed for real trouble. How do you put those two together? Well, symbols, striking images, references to things that people might have in common about experiences in nature? I don't know. But if you can do that, you can create terrific voltage and power. Okay. Thanks.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Yep.